So tonight we have a very special guest. All of our guests are special, but tonight's is particularly special. If any of you have listened to our podcast, The Fog of Truth, you have heard the voice of Christopher Llewellyn Reed. And we've been doing this for a while. We've wrapping up our 9th season and starting our 10th one really soon. We just had a great interview with Barbara Koppel yesterday. Was that yesterday?
Yeah, it was just yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah. And aside from talking about documentaries, Chris also writes about independent film, and he does film reviews for Hammer to Nail Film Festival today. And also is a teacher like I am, but you know, I'm just like a regular teacher. Chris is a department chair. So he's a very busy guy. He has power. And he also has power because he edits my copy. So he takes all my best jokes out. But when I talked to Chris about what to show, Chris, one of the things he suggested was this film, The Death of Stalin, which I'm really glad that you picked because it's a film that I really enjoy. I think it says a lot about where we are today. But one of the other things that's great about having Chris on this, talking about this film, is that Chris also is a Russian scholar, right?
Yeah, so for years, right? So I guess if you consider from the time I started college, when my specialization began, through to the time I started my second graduate degree and began to abandon what I'd been doing before, that's 11 years spent in the study of then first the Soviet Union, and then subsequently Russia, and traveling to the Soviet Union in 1988, and then taking my final trip. I can't believe, if you told me back then it would be my final trip, I wouldn't have believed you, but taking my final trip in January of 98, as I was already in my first year of film school, not realizing that was going to be the last time. If I were to go to Russia now, I wouldn't recognize Moscow, where it was a city I once knew super, super well, because Putin, of course, this is before Putin. So the last time I went to Russia was before Putin's rise to power. Yeltsin was still president. So yeah, I would not recognize the place, I am sure.
So Chris, you are uniquely the person to talk about what in this film is, what really happened to Stalin, and is how much of this resembles any kind of sense of truth.
Right. So Armando Iannucci, the director of this film, right, is perhaps best known for things like Veep. And a political satire that he made before doing The Death of Stalin, because he's done a lot of TV, called In the Loop, where he was much more in his wheelhouse, because In the Loop is dealing with American and British operatives. And then just this year, it's supposed to be coming out this month, actually. He did a film that I saw almost a year ago at Toronto called The Personal History of David Copperfield, which with Dev Patel as David Copperfield. And if you want to see a film that's really interesting in its total disregard for any racial logic in its casting, which is great, I recommend The Personal History of David Copperfield. All of those share a very similar aesthetic. So he's completely out of his wheelhouse here in terms of his knowledge of Soviet history, but I think he gets a lot of things essentially right in terms of human behavior while playing fast and loose with the facts, right? So the general broad strokes of what happened to Beria and to Stalin and everyone else, the broad strokes wise is correct, right? How it happened, but it's grossly condensed. Beria was not shot like that within a week of Stalin's death. It took months. It took, time from Stalin's death before Beria was arrested, and then it took until December of that year for Beria to be tried, much like you see here, tried very quickly and executed, but not again in the week Stalin's death. So it's more like a 6-month process total than a week process. So he's completely conflating a lot of stuff. I don't think the film is meant to be an historically accurate drama. It's more a satire, and much like everything else he does. But through satire, I think you do get some essential truths about human behavior. And in particular, I think you get essential truths about what happens in authoritarian societies when everyone is terrified of being called out for saying something against the state, against power. Even people who are then in power are afraid of power. They can't even decide what to do about Stalin when he's lying there on the floor. It is true that Stalin and Beria and the Central Committee had basically gotten rid of all the competent doctors. That is true. The doctor's plot was one of
That's just one of the most amazing things.
Yeah, it was one of the many purges. It was just the latest in a series of purges. If Donald Trump and today's GOP were to stay in power in the United States, I think we would see similar purgings of competence, because everything would be in service of politics and ideology. Right. And I think that's a very dangerous thing, regardless of what ideology one adheres to. You cannot have a country built on that expected to run efficiently.
And it's of course ironic that he gets rid of all the doctors and there are no doctors left to save him.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of accuracy to that. I'm sure again Yanucci is grossly oversimplifying, but in any case, despite these liberties with the facts, I think there are quite a lot of things that ring true. And what I also like about the film, there's only one main actor in the entire film who's actually Slavic, right? It's Olga Kurylenko, who plays the pianist, right? Uh-huh. Everyone else is American or British. And so there's none of this like usual Hollywood thing of making people speak English with a foreign accent, which I approve of. I always find it a little silly to have English-speaking actors adopt an accent of the country of the character they're playing in order for it to sound like they're speaking a foreign language. I'd much rather they just speak English. As a quick tangent, one of my favorite examples of the use of accents within the English language was the HBO show Rome, where all the upper classes spoke with sort of posh British refined accents. All the legionnaires and working class people spoke with working class British accents, and all the slaves, people from throughout the empire, they spoke with foreign accents in English, which made perfect sense.
Boy, I haven't seen that in a long time, but you're right. I remember that now that you mentioned that. I mean, it is one of the sort of striking things to hear a film of Russian history with all the actors speaking English. And it's like there was a time when we would have been all in Russian with subtitles, but clearly that was there is this trend now of having like Jojo Rabbit, which has a lot of English in it, that there is a way that's sort of being done now as a technique. Which is odd to me, but it allows for incredible casting.
Right. I mean, it's odd to you because we've gotten so used to this Hollywood trope of I am a Russian man in a Hollywood movie. I speak English like this, and we go, aha, he is Russian. Even though that's ridiculous, right? I mean, why would a Russian speak like this? Somebody asked in the chat, first of all, Raquel Chapa just linked to an article, History Buffs, surprising how much is true. Yeah, again, the basic broad strokes are true. And then Catherine Yingling, so I was born in 1969. I'm 51 now. So I was coming of age in the 80s at a time when the Soviet Union there was a rapprochement with the Soviet Union, and I thought I wanted to do politics. And I had actually taken Russian earlier at a middle school in Baltimore that offered Russian, and then it didn't work out because of scheduling. So I had a taste of Russian in the early 80s. And then when I got to college, I was determined to pick that up again. And it seemed like a good time, right? 1986, you think about, Gorbachev is in power, things changing, and it just seemed like I already had a mild background in Russian. It seemed like a good language to take to pursue my politics. I didn't like the government courses I was taking at all, so I dropped that. And I instead became very enamored of Russian history and literature without any knowledge of what I would do with that degree, but I pursued it anyway.
So let's talk a little bit about the casting.
Yeah.
Of course, it's an incredible cast. I don't know what your thoughts are, but I thought Steve Buscemi is incredible. And he just, you don't think of Buscemi like that. And, I grew up, I was born in 1953 when this happened.
Wow.
And so my perspective on Khrushchev was like, he was the epitome of evil. That's what we were taught growing up, and to see Steve Buscemi playing him, it just was a really odd disconnect.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you say he's the epitome of evil, because I think obviously in the Kennedy era, right, that's how he was presented. But, I've always been of a mind, having, since I studied the history, subsequent to studying the history of the period, I've always been of the opinion that the person who really saved us from nuclear annihilation in the 60s was less Kennedy than Khrushchev, because it's the person who backs down in a fight.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah. So if you're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's actually Khrushchev who suffered politically. In a different era, he would have been, probably shot like Beria. But by that point, he did enact enough reforms in the Soviet Union that, though it was still an authoritarian place, people were not so arbitrarily shot in the 60s. And so he was allowed to retire and live out his life in an isolated way. But I think he suffered a real political price for backing down. So anyway, it's just an aside to say that, yes, I think, he was certainly with the shoe banging, right, villain, but I think he's the one who saved the world by backing down.
And that's a really great point. But, in the propaganda of growing up in that era, it was just good and evil, and they were evil, and he was the head evil. And that's just the perception of what we had. Speaking of evil, Simon Russell Beale, who played that
Beria?
Beria.
Lavrenti Beria, yeah.
Reminds me of Dick Cheney.
It's interesting. Now, Lavrenti Beria really was, that's accurate. Lavrenti Beria was a vile human being. A vile, vile human being. He was a sexual deviant who wanted to have sex with, I think he stuck to women, but, people of all ages, very young girls, any woman that struck his fancy, he would have them scooped up. He had absolute power in terms of that. As long as he kept things in line for Stalin, he could do whatever he wanted. And so, Khrushchev's own actions in the Stalin era were not without sin, but Beria was really the sort of the evil homunculus behind the power. And I think Khrushchev, whatever his considerable failings as a human being, as you had to have failings as a human being to survive in the Stalin era, understood that and really wanted to get rid of Beria in order for his country to sort of become a more normally functioning place. He understood the dangers of the secret police under Beria. So that's a totally accurate portrayal from everything I've ever read about Beria. He was a sickening human being.
And in the film, the way he's when he does all those horrible things, he's just so matter of fact about all the torture he's doing. Put his wife next door, make sure she's really loud, and not even, oh, look, we get the dog as well.
He's circling around my feet, desperate for play, but you'll have to wait till we're done. This is Lizzie.
Well, I can get Cece Rocket over here. She's right behind me, except she would probably bite me.
Well, Lizzie's not so happy about being a lap dog, so I'm going to put her down.
So what about the rest of the cast? Who else did you particularly like?
I really like Buscemi. I really like Simon Russell Beale. I thought the actor playing Stalin, Adrian McLaughlin, was also very good. I mean, they all sort of get at this this idea of really entitled people who are also terrified because they haven't heretofore had real power themselves. I think my favorite though is Jason Isaacs as the swaggering Marshal Zhukov. Um, he's just
Chewing up the scenery.
Like Isaacs. I have a soft spot ever since I saw him in this film called Nine Lives by the director Rodrigo Garcia, where he has one of the most devastating scenes because it's 9 short films about women at crisis points in their lives, and he does a scene with Robin Wright, who then was Robin Wright Penn. And ever since that, I've been a fan. But of course, he's an amazing actor, right? He's in one of the Star Treks. He was Lucius Malfoy in the Harry Potter series. He's great. So I love him as Marshal Zhukov. He just
and Jeffrey Tambor's character.
Yeah, I mean Jeffrey Tambor, of course, now is a problematic figure because of what we've learned about his behavior on Arrested Development and Transparent. But I think he's great as Malenkov. Michael Palin as Molotov is also wonderful.
I mean, I love the thing with his character when, like, after watching the Westerns, he finds out that he's on the list.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean that there's so many things in the early scenes that really give you the sense of the angst of what it's like to live in a world like that.
Right. And don't forget, speaking of the early scenes, Paddy Considine, if that's how you pronounce his last name, as the radio maestro. That opening scene is so wonderful and so perfect. Like they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified of what's going to happen to them if they don't get this right. And that poor conductor that they have to pull out of bed, which is a made-up thing. There were a couple of similar type events apparently in the Soviet Union at the time, but I don't know if you can hear my dog Squeaky Toy, but she's going nuts over in the other room trying to get me to play with her.
Yeah, I heard that it happened sometime in the 40s, and the audience had all gone home, so they had to like bring a whole bunch of new people in. But you know, the moment in that really sort of tells about the universe is when Stalin's on the phone and or after that, and they're saying, "Oh, Stalin has the best ears. He can determine if this was, you know," and that really so much resonates with right now, but it also gets at the whole sense of what Stalinism is like.
Right, and that actually it has been so. As a student of Soviet history, I've obviously seen lots of parallels in the type of cultish language that surrounds the cult of 45. Because in the Soviet Union, you know, obviously I went there for the first time long after Stalin was dead, but there were lots and lots of stories and anekdoti, as they say in Russian, right? The anecdotes telling about people saying these very things. Oh, Stalin was a great connoisseur of music, great understander of art, understood everything. Basically, there was nothing that he could not do, and all these anecdoti, which of course is impossible and absurd. The man was, barely literate, and he had the one thing you can say for Stalin, if you're going to say anything complimentary, is he had great physical courage. Right? He'd been in a Tsarist prison and escaped and made his way all the way home. So he was clearly a man of action when it counted, and in different circumstances. That's a wonderful characteristic. Right. But yeah, I mean, he's obviously, like our current president, hardly a cultured individual, which in and of itself is not a sin, except that, to have people say all these things is just absolutely absurd.
And I just love the scene of them watching a Western movie and he's into it and everybody else is asleep.
Right. Yeah. And certainly I think the Soviet leaders in general loved Hollywood films.
Yeah. I mean, it just says something about like, you can't leave, but you have to stay there.
Right.
It just, really kind of amazing.
Meanwhile, the output of movies in Russia had like dwindled to almost nothing. right? So, you know, the legacy of Stalin at this time is that people are terrified to do anything. And movies rebounded and art rebounded under Khrushchev. In 1957 is the year where what we start to call the cultural thaw, which lasted from then until 1967, so 3 years after Khrushchev's fall, called in Russian ottepel, or thaw. And you saw an increasing output suddenly of literature, music, and movies. And, you know, there's a film called The Cranes Are Flying, made as this thaw begins. It ended up going to the Cannes Film Festival and winning the Cannes Film Festival, which is just this lovely meditation, finally freed from the shackles of Stalinism, on the human cost of war. Because up until then, anything that dealt with World War II had to deal with it as the quote unquote Great Patriotic War, which is what the Russians called it. They didn't call it World War II. They call it the Great Patriotic War because, yeah, I mean, we can chuckle, but it was, you know, World War II was devastating to the average Russian because, you know, the Nazis invaded and Stalin was perfectly happy to use his people as cannon fodder. And so, yeah, they called it the Great Patriotic War. And the willingness of Russians to sacrifice themselves, willingly or not, is really what helped bring down the Nazis. So anyway, you see this flourishing of the arts after Stalin's death.
Was I Am Cuba part of that thawing process?
So that's a little later, but yes, that's the same director actually as The Cranes Are Flying. That's Mikhail Kalatozov, who's actually a Georgian director. That's a Russification of his name. I forget the actual original Georgian last name he has. Like Stalin and like Beria, Kalatozov was Georgian.
So this film is a comedy, but it's not like any other comedy that I can remember. It's funny, it's dark comedy, but like I've seen it with an audience that wasn't laughing, but laughing inside. There's something about the tone that is really kind of almost perfect, but doesn't really, it's not like other kinds of comedy.
Well, but I think it's very much in line with what this director Armando Iannucci does, right?
Like
so,
Veep.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's biting satire, right? So, I mean, there are moments, I think, of real humor, but it's not necessarily laugh out loud. Haha. Yeah. It's more kind of like you're saying, you're chuckling, you're wincing in pain, but it definitely resonates, but it doesn't necessarily make you burst out laughing. Though rewatching the film to prepare for tonight, I did find myself laughing more. I'm just going to close my office door so that Lizzie stays in here rather than running around finding different toys to bring me.
So while he's going, does somebody have a question that they haven't asked in the chat? Yes.
I'm back. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you're back. That was awfully quick.
Oh, Lisa Sancello's here too. Yes.
Yes.
Who did you mean he's such a great bad guy? Did you mean Beria, Lisa?
Isaac.
Oh, Jason Isaac. Yeah, Azuka. Yeah. Although, is he a bad guy here? I mean, he's kind of one of the heroes in the world of the movie.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. He is a man of action.
Yes.
Yes, and he has a lot of really good lines. I mean, there are a lot of really good lines in this. And the kids of Stalin are both pretty amazing characters.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. You asked about actors. Andrea Riseborough and Rupert Friend are great. I just recently started watching Homeland, and Rupert Friend shows up in season 2 of Homeland. If you've seen Homeland, yeah, he's one of the CIA operatives, like everyone else in the show, deeply troubled. Like there's not a single person in that show who's not troubled. But yeah, I thought they were wonderful, Rupert Friend and Andrea Riseborough.
All right, Mark, have we answered your question? How would you compare what a contemporary American audience might learn about life in Russia in Stalin's time from this film compared to reading Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fade in translation?
Which I have not read, Life and Fate, so I can't talk about that. I just want to quickly, I'll respond to that, but let's not forget also Ina Troik's question that it's worth mentioning the film was never released in Russia. We can talk about that in a moment.
I heard it was banned in Russia.
It was banned, but it still got shown in a couple of places. Hold on, I just want to do one thing. Lizzie, where'd you go? Come here, come here. Go, 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 go.
Lizzie is usually better during our podcasting.
Yeah, but this is the time when she wants play. She's literally, this is the time when my dog will stare at me. She's a beagle, very vocal when she sees other animals. Not vocal at all in her interactions with me. And this is what she'll do for an hour usually at night while I'm trying to write something else. She'll just go like this. It's like she's communicating with me telepathically until I can't take it anymore and I play with her. And that's what she's doing now. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment, but I just want to say, so how would you compare what a contemporary American audience might learn about life in Russia in Stalin's time? Yeah, so again, I haven't read Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fate, but in terms of what one, I think, can learn accurately from this film, from what I understand about life in Russia in Stalin's time, is just that fear, the fear of doing anything that makes you seem untrustworthy to the state, or just fear that it doesn't matter what you do because you're going to be targeted anyway. I mean, we see with Beria's changing orders in the beginning, which is played for comedy, but it's horrifying, that people are being tortured and shot, and it's completely arbitrary. Like that, they can be rescued, right? So we cut to the gulag at one point, and they're calling off the executions, but this poor guy that the gun's pointed in front of gets shot anyway, and the people next to him are just, so amazed that they didn't get shot. So I think that is fairly accurate, and it's not unique to Russia. I mean, we can, go to why this film was banned in Russia. I think there's a tendency, from any place that's being spoofed and lampooned in this way to get offended. But I think films like this are rarely only about that one place.
Yeah.
I mean, they are and they aren't. I think out of great specificity come universal truths and warnings. And so in terms of what this film, again, can tell us about the dangers of similar behaviors here at home is what, this is how things start, right? And the willingness to acquiesce to outrageous behavior can snowball gradually into worse and worse things. So I think that's a lesson for all of us.
So Chris, as I watched the film this time, as opposed to when I watched it before, which was early on in the Trump administration, I mean, we all, see the kind of parallels and the fear and the great leader has to be perfect and all those things I think play really well here. But one of the things that struck me is that there is this sense in the Republican Party about what's going to happen when Trump loses. And in a sense, this fight over who takes over for Stalin is like, who's going to take over? Is it going to be Ted Cruz? They're all jockeying for position. I mean, they're not going out killing each other, but the really telling moment, like after he's like, sit on the floor, what does Beria do? What's the first thing he does? He goes to find the documents on everybody else, which I thought was a really incredibly telling moment.
Right, which in the world of the film backfires on him, right? Because that's the moment when they all realize that he's going to stab them all.
Right.
He thinks he's got a weapon that he's wielding. I don't know the accuracy of any of that, but in the world of the movie, it's a good device because Beria thinks he's holding all the cards, but what he doesn't realize is that he's gone too far and made them all realize exactly how dangerous he is, and they'd rather go with Khrushchev, who, this is true, by the way, one of the things that Khrushchev said in later life was that how he survived throughout all those years of purges was because Stalin thought he was funny and didn't see him as a threat. And by being seen as a bit of a buffoon, he survived. And so we get that scene, that moment at the dinner table, the last night of Stalin's life, where Stalin's like, oh, this guy's so funny. And, I mean, that's an exaggeration, but, that is partly how Khrushchev actually survived.
Yeah, the scene where they're bumping each other in their stomachs, and then this thing with the tomato was just like...
I mean, nobody took Khrushchev. He was a Ukrainian peasant, right? Is is how he sort of, was seen a bumbling fool, but he was a pretty smart guy. And he bided his time, and he outsmarted all of those people to get into power. He even outsmarted Zhukov, by the way, in real life. So like Zhukov ended up on the Central Committee after helping Khrushchev get rid of rivals. And then he didn't kill Zhukov, but he ended up getting him demoted after that, because he did fear his popularity. He was very popular and he had the Red Army. So he even outsmarted Zhukov until eventually, as leader, right, you then become the target of other people's machinations.
I also really like the scenes where Khrushchev was writing down and telling his wife everything he said and everybody else said at the end of every night, as a survival mechanism to make sure that you know what happened. Boy, that's a scary thought. Although nowadays you just use your phone.
To go back to what you were saying about the jockeying for position and how you were wondering about parallels with what will happen if and when Trump is ever gone. I think that's actually a really good point, because even though we are not yet at a point in this country where we're at all similar to the kinds of horrors that were happening under Stalin, I think the Republican Party, today's Republican Party, has debased itself enough which is why you've got this whole offshoot, the Lincoln Project, whatever you think of them. There are plenty of Republicans who don't like Donald Trump. But the people in power in most places in the Republican Party have had to so debase themselves that I think it's a similar process of people who are so without their own personality at this point that it probably there'll be a lot of backstabbing. There'll probably be a lot of people claiming they were never really Trump fans.
Right. But now there's evidence. You can't just say.
When has evidence ever stopped people from? I mean, Trump will be confronted with evidence, and 5 seconds later he's denying it. I mean, it's the whole Orwell 1984
totalitarianism playbook. I mean, it's like lying and just telling people there is no such thing as truth, and that's happening all the time. Somebody just wrote a long message.
Yeah, I'll read it if you want. It's a good paragraph. So
wait a minute, Russ, would you like to read this yourself?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself first. There you go.
Okay, I believe, Christopher, you indicated that Martin Amis's thesis is that the Russians are able to laugh about Stalin while Germans can't do the same with respect to Hitler. And I'm thinking about people like us, other than Germans or Russians. So my question is, why are we able to laugh about Stalin but not Hitler, given that Stalin was actually, I believe, in terms of numbers, more murderous than Hitler? My tentative notion is just that Stalin's crimes are less real to us than Hitler's are, because we just weren't, we haven't considered them to the same extent. We haven't known Stalin's victims the way we've heard Holocaust victims be interviewed, and seen them on television, films. So it's something we can abstract ourselves from and distance ourselves.
Someone just made a comment about Mel Brooks and Springtime for Hitler, which is true. We have been able to laugh at Hitler, but
and you can't forget Hogan's Heroes, which is not Hitler, but
it's not
the most absurd television show other than a talking.
And by the way, do you know that the guy who played the French guy in that was actually a survivor?
Right, he was, yes.
Yeah, as I learned watching the documentary "The Last Laugh."
Last Laugh, which is a great documentary.
I did not know that until I watched that documentary. So
but Springtime for Hitler, I don't think, by the way, I mean, I'm not sure that in and of itself invalidates the premise.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's just an example, maybe the exception that proves the rule. I think there is something particularly horrific about targeted genocide that makes it impossible to find anything that Hitler did once everyone knew the truth of that so amusing. Although there is something always absurd about, I think, totalitarian societies with the forced allegiance. And I think they're always ripe, therefore, for satire. But the actual crimes of Hitler, because they're targeted against one particular group with the goal of effacing them from the planet. You know, Stalin also committed acts of genocide within the Soviet Union, and forced repatriation and moving people around. I mean, so he's a monster. You know, it's just, I mean, you might be right, Russ, that it's because more is known because the Germans lost the war, and so the crimes were fully exposed. Yeah, I don't disagree that all allegiance is forced and that there are many, many true believers. That's true, Mark.
I also think that that there was all this film of what the Germans did. I mean, they documented everything.
Right. Whereas all we know, I mean, much of what we know from the Soviet crimes is what they've been willing to tell people, that there have been people who research. I mean, it's not like we don't know the crimes, but it's been harder to get at all the facts. And plus, at various times, the Soviets had been less willing, and now the Russians, you know, under Putin, for example, to go back to why this film was banned, you know, there's a lot of embarrassment about foreign, you know, the last 20 years, Putin has basically recreated the Soviet Union in terms of this, you know, strong nationalist mentality, and, you know, lack of truth. There was this like decade where the Russians were briefly exploring wild democracy, and not surprisingly, in a decade with no guide rails, it didn't work so well. So they went back to the model they knew, and we're in a period where it's not like anybody going to Russia today would probably get a lot of cooperation in exploring the crimes of Stalin. And that is why there's a lot of national embarrassment at a film like this. And the film was indeed, it had its visa to be exported to the Soviet Union, to Russia, and then it was yanked. A lot of artists, you know, people you'd like to think would be open-minded, also spoke out against the film, but a few theaters apparently did screen it anyway, because they had it on their slate, and they were apparently sued by the government. I don't know how that went. Somebody's talking, well, Raquel was talking about the anti-Semitism behind the Doctor's plot, and I agree, this film doesn't touch upon the anti-Semitism at all. I'm guessing Iannucci probably, and I'm not defending this decision, but he probably just thought he had enough on his plate with what he had for a relatively short film. But I agree with you. The Doctor's plot was inherently anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Certainly Stalin was not himself. He was also quite prone to anti-Semitism, just like the Nazis, which is ironic, given how much the Soviet Union always liked to portray itself as a bastion of tolerance. They used that, as Bart and I just recently saw this discussion in this film called Black in Space by Lorenz Grant. The Soviets used our own history of racial oppression against minorities against us in the space race, and they were the first to send a person of color into space. And they, you know, they lambasted the Nazis for their anti-Semitism, but there are plenty of purges that were anti-Semitic in nature in the Soviet Union, not to mention in the Russian Empire, of course, the pogroms, which the people who committed those pogroms didn't go away when the Soviet Union became the Soviet Union.
That's for sure. So somebody was asking about the photos, the erasing the photos. What's the story about that? Is that something that really happened?
Yeah. So yes, and I've never studied at length how many photos were doctored, but yeah, no, people, they would, there's clear evidence that surfaced at various times when there was an ability to research this, of people being removed from photos. I'm not a photographic developer, so I don't know the chemical process behind doing that in the days before Photoshop, but clearly where there's a will, there's a way. It can't be that hard to do because it was done.
Okay, what else do we have? What other questions have we not asked? Anti-Semitism is not hidden in Russia today?
Definitely not. And you know, something that always struck me in the Soviet Union when I started visiting there, I mean, it's incredible, really. But, you know, being Jewish was viewed, it wasn't obviously it's religious, but it was viewed as a nationality, ethnic identity thing above all. So on your passport, right, you would get to choose, maybe, unless you had two parents who were the same, variety of nationalities. So if you were a Kazakh, born of a Kazakh and a Russian, maybe living in Kazakhstan, but you could choose on your passport if you were Kazakh or Russian. One of the many ethnicities beyond the 15 republics or 16, I forget now, republics within the Soviet Union was Jewish. Of course, there is no Jewish federation within the Soviet Union, so it's odd, right, that you'd have Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, blah, 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 and Jewish. That was a category on the passport. So yes, obviously, the Soviets inherited all the anti-Semitism of the Russian Empire, and of course, the Russian secret police, the Tsar's secret police, are the ones who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of the most virulently anti-Semitic texts ever written. So, and it's not hidden today, as Mark is saying. Sure, I mean, Russian nationalism is a powerful force there. I mean, one of the ways in which Putin consolidated power in the early aughts was by rebuilding all the churches. Well, we can't say he rebuilt all of them. When you see paintings of Russia before the revolution, there was like literally like Starbucks on every street corner. There was a church on every street corner. I mean, it's amazing. You can understand why the Bolsheviks wanted to get rid of religion. I mean, it was everywhere. And by the time I started traveling to the Soviet Union, there were still churches, right? And held up as, you know, landmark architectural landmarks, but so many had been destroyed. And so one of the things Putin did was starting to rebuild ties with the church. And that's one of the ways that anti-Semitism has flourished, especially, I think, in the last 20 years, along with Putin's anti-gay rhetoric, has been sort of in his alliance with the church.
I want to talk a little bit about the actual funeral in the film and what that was like. And I thought it was interesting that Khrushchev was, you know, in charge of the decorations and how to choose between this color and that color and this and that. But the pomp and circumstance, and then, you know, did you invite the religious people? I mean, there's a lot of interesting intrigue. I mean, where everything else in the film is sort of about what's happening in the background, this was something that was very public, and it's sort of a public moment in the film.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember reading when I was studying Russian that one of the ways you could really understand the weird machinations of the Politburo, right? So the governing body was to understand its roots in the Russian Orthodox Church. So if you've ever attended a Russian Orthodox service, you know that unlike other Christian churches, and I'm assuming this might be the same for Greek Orthodox, but I've only been to Russian Orthodox services, all of the sort of stuff, the making of things happens behind the iconostasis, right? So it's like the real goings on happen behind an iconostasis, whereas in like a Catholic church and an Episcopal church or something, it would happen openly for people to see. And then the priests sort of come out with the communion wine and the bread and deliver it to the masses. And so this sort of power structure thing was replicated by Soviet leaders, even as much as they disdain religion, but it's so built into the behavior of the hierarchy there. And so it is interesting what you said, Bart, that, you know, all these things are happening behind closed doors, but then you have this public display because you have to have the masses in some way feel like they are getting their occasional glimpse of power. And, you know, Stalin's body lay in the mausoleum next to Lenin. I don't know the exact year, but Khrushchev is the one who took it away. So he wasn't in state for very long. I think, I mean, I haven't been to Russia in 20 years, right? So, but I think Lenin is still in the mausoleum. I've seen Lenin's body. It's weird and creepy. But yeah, I'm pretty sure, because it's a great tourist attraction. I think I would have read it if he weren't. But yeah, for like 3 or 4 years, Stalin was lying next to Lenin, and I forget when he was taken down. So that's a weird thing too.
Getting back to the funeral, I mean, all of these people came out to see him. And, you know, when I think of Stalin, I think everybody's afraid of him. If he's dead, you don't have to be afraid of him anymore. Why were all these people coming to show great warmth to him? I mean, it looks like a scene from JFK's, you know, lying in state. All these people coming in, getting shot, some of them, while they're getting in, and the whole thing with the trains, which I thought was really kind of interesting as well.
But does that really surprise you? I mean, we've been talking about cults.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're, I mean, there's a reason why the Russian Revolution happened. I mean, we can talk about the crimes of the communists during the Soviet Union, but just like there's a reason why the Cuban Revolution happened. We can talk, you know, about how the horrible things that Fidel Castro became, but revolutions happen for a reason, right? So Russia, if you weren't part of the minuscule, you know, class of the aristocracy, and you know, the sort of middle class, business class that had been developing throughout the 19th century, it's a pretty miserable place to live. And the Soviet rulers actually did, an effective job of uplifting people who did not have a lot. I'm not saying they did it in a way that was humane or that was ultimately positive. But, you know, at the time of the revolution, like 80% of the population at least was illiterate and lived in the countryside. And they brought people to the cities. They electrified the nation. They industrialized the nation. They gave people there. By the time Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union was a world power. And, you know, all of these things, I think, help make the people love their tyrant, along with, you know, other psychological reasons that we could discuss. But I mean, yeah, Stalin was a sociopath, but he was also the father figure of the country, and a country that had, in the minds of many of simple people, even people whose families like Molotov had suffered. You know, you had the people like the character played by Kurylenko who bore resentment, right, and wanted Stalin to die, but you also had people who it just made them love the state even more. I won't ever understand that psychology, but I haven't lived in that environment. Maybe I would if I were a child of a totalitarian society.
I don't think so. So Chris, did you write a review of this for Hammer to Nail? Or
I didn't. I did not. I only saw this film long after it came out, so I have not reviewed it.
Okay. If you were reviewing it, what would you say about it in a review? What would your first sentence
You want me to compose like an excellent spoken word poet or a hip hop artist who can improvise on the spot? I can't do that. I can't.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, I've basically been saying everything that I would say in a composed way, which is that I think the film has a lot to say about our time and moment now. It's while taking liberties with the facts, I think spiritually it's true to the time and the place and the effect of of a totalitarian society and people's psychologies, and it's filled with great performances.
Yeah. Yeah. And timely to just look at what's happening in our country. I mean, there's a reason why films are made the time they are about the past, because they say something about what's happening now.
You know, Raquel has a comment here about interesting that with Confederate statues debate, several Black activists have suggested we do what we did in Russia and leave the statues knocked over. Yeah, but not knocked over where they fell, but in a fallen monuments park. I don't disagree. That actually is not a bad idea. Yeah, I would support that.
We went that in Budapest.
Yes.
Remember that we went to
yes.
that?
Yeah.
It was cool.
Yeah, it was very interesting to just see all the Soviet style statues in one place. It was, and I think it's good to sort of see what it was. And I think somewhere I have the DVD of the movie about the Soviet era that they showed.
You know,
which was really great.
There's one of my favorite authors on the terrible legacy of authoritarianism on a country's culture, history, sense of place, and psychology is Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. Now, he's an author who, as I've gotten older, I recognize the problematic ways in which he writes about women, particularly in a book like The Unbearable Lightness of Being. But that doesn't take away from me for a lot. I mean, he's a Czech author who lived through, the Czechoslovakia when it was communist, and then he fled for France. And I think that book in particular, it talks about the erasing of a country's cultural legacy and what that does. I recommend it as a great way to sort of explore what it's like to live in a totalitarian place.
Do you remember the last shot of the film?
The cinders going up.
Yeah, but before that, in the concert, you're looking at Khrushchev and who's behind him.
Oh, yeah. I think that's it's Brezhnev. Yeah. Well,
Yes.
because like I said, like his time will come too, right?
Right. I mean, that was the point of that shot, which I thought was totally brilliant. It just gives a whole sense of the whole film. It's like, yes, your turn will come.
Of course, Brezhnev himself, although he was able to live out his term, but he was always a bit of a joke of a leader, not a great thinker, just kind of put in there to take over because people didn't like what Khrushchev was doing. But of course, if you see Chernobyl, I think maybe it's not Chernobyl. I saw something recently that had an image.
You should see Chernobyl.
No, Chernobyl's great.
Very
I know
important
what it
to
was.
see.
It's a sci-fi. I think it's a sci-fi film I saw recently. But anyway, I recently saw this portrayal of Brezhnev in a film either about Russia or a Russian film that accurately portrayed him as this kind of drunken dotard in his final moments, unable to do anything, kind of like Yeltsin towards the end of his life.
But I think one of the things that you're sort of saying here is the film talks about what is good and bad leadership, which is something that's like really a problem. It's like, we right now have very bad leadership in our country, and there is value in having people that have the right kind of values, that are smart, that can think, that have compassion. And it's like, who are all these people? One guy drops and all these other people have the wrong instincts to lead. And how important leadership is in the world. And people think when they voted for Donald Trump, they thought anybody could be president. You don't need to know anything. And boy, now everybody knows that it's a hard job that you actually have to work at, and that you have to have the ability to run, to sort of have empathy and to care about things. And I think that's really important. And I think that's one of the things that you sort of see in this film.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have a little chat going in on the side about Milan Kundera, and I recommended another Czech author, Bohumil Hrabal, both of which are, I think, great insights into a lot of life in at least the Czech Republic under communist rule.
You mentioned Chernobyl, which is the HBO series.
Which is actually a great companion to this in terms of examination although at least there, Gorbachev was a better leader to have handled that than previous Soviet leaders would have been, but still. But it's like, I, for a long time, didn't want to see it because I didn't want to see dead bodies, and I didn't want to see like what the catastrophe was. But it's really about what happens when you live in a country where people can say, oh, we made a mistake, and they have to hide it. And what happens when they won't fess up to things that are going on, and how much worse it gets. And I think that is very similar, that same sort of attitude about what's in this film and part of what's happening in this country. No, I'm glad you said that, Bart, because I think Chernobyl is actually a much stronger parallel to a lot of the perils we're seeing right now with the denial of science and fact, because people die. Obviously people died under Stalin because he killed them. But in terms of what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 80s, it was a different Soviet Union. Gorbachev was not arbitrarily shooting people. It really was a different country for all its problems. But same thing, if you deny science, people will die. And I agree with you. Chernobyl, which is a great series. I finally subscribed to HBO Max this summer, so I've been watching a lot of HBO stuff.
Yeah, and HBO Max won't play on my Roku, which really pisses me off.
Yeah, well, I have an Amazon Fire Stick as well. I also have a Roku TV, but it plays on the Fire Stick.
I have to stream it from my iPhone through Apple TV.
So Kelly Kitchen says that she met Kundera outside of Paris in 1989. That's great. Yeah, he does, all his writing now is in French. And he's gone back and he has, so like if you read his stuff starting in the mid 90s, it's all been written in French, which since I'm half French, that's great because I can read, I don't read Czech, but I can read him in the quote unquote original. And he's gone back and he's redone, he's looked over all of the translations of his work from Czech to French. And so all the translations of his earlier works, he's approved in French. So that means they're probably more legitimate than reading them if you read French in other languages in terms of adhering to the language. But that is so cool that you met him, Kelly. I envy you that. I met Stellan Skarsgård, speaking of Chernobyl, last year at Toronto, and that was fun. He's a delightful human being.
Yeah, that's very good. Do we have any other questions from anybody? If
I should
not,
ask Kelly, how was Kundera when you met him outside of Paris in 1989?
Very aloof, but welcoming. He talked to our, I went to I'm sorry, can't speak. I did an honors program out of University of North Texas, went to the American College of Switzerland, and we were there in 1989, and we had a field trip where we went and met with him, and I was just, I loved, and you phased out on my computer when you were talking about The Unbearable Lightness of Being, but that book literally changed my life. So I don't know what you said about it, but I loved it.
I was just saying that I recognize, I used to really love everything about Kundera, and then I began as I got older to find some problems with his depictions of women, though he also has some really amazing women in his work. I mean, like really, you know, like he writes, you know, women with great agency as well. So it's just sometimes when he's talking more sexually, some of that hasn't aged as well for me. But I love, I do love, and he was very important.
No, it hasn't at all.
Yeah, well, he was very important to me at a particular part of my life.
So Russ asked about, could you imagine a film like this being made about a totalitarian leadership in China?
No, because they're still in power. I mean, no, I cannot. And you would not see a satire. I mean, are you saying like being made about the totalitarian leadership in China by an American or by a non-Chinese director? And that's a really good question because so much of the film world is determined by the Chinese market because it's such a big market. So that's a really good question.
Well, but then if you think about it, there was, what was the name of that film about Korea? The comedy.
Somebody just said that it's called The Interview.
The Interview, right, yeah, which did get made, and speculation was that that's why Sony got hacked, because the Koreans went after it.
Although I've also read subsequent speculation that it could have just been disgruntled employees at Sony. But whatever the truth of it is, it did create a bit of a problem. And I think China is far more powerful than North Korea.
Yes.
And certainly for the film business. I mean, literally the Asian market, in particular the Chinese market, has become, I mean, we'll see what happens. What's going to happen to theatrical exhibition in the future? It may not exist anymore.
I think it will exist. It just will be changed.
It will be changed, right? But the Chinese market has been so important. That is really
absolutely
a question. Like it would have to be a totally independent film made by a person who does not care about the Chinese market. Their film's small enough. It's being picked up by a distributor who does not care. Yeah, I agree about Zhang Yimou's films are very subtly political, but he is not the same director that he was in the 80s and 90s. he has become far more nationalistic in his filmmaking. He was a different director when he made films like Judao and Raise the Red Lantern.
Yeah.
He's not the same director now.
Yeah. So in the minute we have left, Chris, I would just love to, you start school how soon?
I start school at the end of August.
And what's going to happen? Are you going to be in person, and are you going to be hybrid? And how is your faculty? Are they revolting or complaining, or what's going on?
So you can see my dog better without me having a background. So Stevenson University is coming back face-to-face as of right now, but any faculty or students who have medical issues that make them afraid to do that can file for accommodations. And any person who has other reasons why they think they can't come back for face-to-face classes can file for what we're calling an adjustment. In addition, because of social distancing rules in place, a number of our classes are being taught under a hybrid model where if you meet twice a week, you'll meet with one half of the students on one day, other half on another day, and then the students who aren't in class on one day will watch a live stream of what's happening in class that day. And then both of the classes I'm teaching this fall are being taught in person because they haven't been approved to be hybrid.
Well, stay safe. It's
Well,
important.
wait a minute. Those students that don't feel safe, or they have medical conditions, they don't want to come to school. What happens to them? They just don't go to school?
No, well, yeah, they
do Zoom like we're doing right now.
We're going to be live streaming everything.
Oh, you will? Oh, okay.
And I've designed, even the classes that I'm teaching live, I have designed with this in mind. I don't know, I haven't received any adjustments, but like all the films I've chosen to screen are ones that I could instantly make available online for the students who need it. We've all designed our course, and we're front loading all technical instruction in case we suddenly have to go entirely remote for everything. So that's where we are right now.
Excellent. Well, Chris, thank you so much. This was really wonderful. It's great to talk about something that's not a documentary with you. Do you have anything you'd like to plug before you leave?
Well, I just want to say Raquel wrote the One Child Policy doc, which is made by two Chinese women, both right now based in the United States, Yili Zhang and Nanfu Wang. And they had to be very careful. And I don't know now what it would be like for them to go back, but I think they're going to be scrutinized with their travel if they're trying to make films. So that's an excellent example.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you all for coming. I am not sure what next week's film will be, but the week after we're doing 13th, which will be really great. Read the newsletter, which will show up in your email box on Monday, and you'll know what it is you'll be doing. If you have any questions, you can email me, bart@videofest.org. You can read Chris's fine work in Hammer to Nail and Film Festival Today, where he's always writing about contemporary work. He's really brilliant and has a lot of really great ideas. And thank you all for coming. That's it. We'll see you next week.
Thank you all so much. If you are a listener to our podcast, please shoot us an email at disinfo@fogoftruth.com with your favorite moments. We're including them in our next bonus episode.
Right. We're doing our bonus episode of like People's Choice. What are the best things you remember? What are things that you heard that you really like? So, and if you've never listened to our podcast, it's The Fog of Truth, and any place you can get a podcast, you can go. We have our website is fogoftruth.com, and you can, all the back episodes and show notes are there. So, so thank you all. We'll see you next week. thanks for folks who are in town and from out of town. For folks in town, also this week is the Texas Women's Film Festival that's going on. So you might want to check that out. Yeah, have a great week.